Tom Bower, the legendary royal author, is sharpening his quill for a new edition of his book set to reveal huge secrets inside Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's marriage.
King Charles did not raise his voice. He did something far more devastating. Behind closed doors, with only a handful of senior figures aware of what was happening, the king withdrew the last private royal privilege Camilla still exercised in his name. She understood the consequence immediately. But hundreds of miles away, Meghan's reaction was even sharper. Because Charles had not merely weakened his wife, he had quietly destroyed an arrangement Meghan desperately needed. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles finished reading the private household order and set his pen down. The document removed Camilla's king's household override, a dramatized authority allowing her to issue or reverse internal household instructions using the monarch's approval. This was not merely another privilege on paper. Her ceremonial status remained untouched, but this was the final independent channel through which she could influence sensitive decisions without returning to her husband for direct consent. He looked across at her and spoke quietly. "From today, nothing leaves this office in my name unless I approve it myself." Camilla did not answer. She stayed seated, stunned. The silence cut deeper because the queen consort understood the personal wound beneath the institutional one. Charles was not removing her place beside him. He was removing confidence in how she had used his authority. For years, that distinction had given her influence no title could fully describe. Now it was gone. William already knew the decision was coming, and in a private recorded conversation with his father, the prince had urged him to end competing channels after household instructions began being questioned and reversed. The future king believed uncertainty at the center had become dangerous. Meghan learned the news through a private call and reacted with immediate fury. Her anger was not driven by sympathy for Camilla alone. She had been relying on the queen consort as the only senior figure still willing to discuss limited family access and possible future ceremonial invitations for the Sussexes. That possibility mattered because direct trust with Charles remained fragile, while William had little patience for informal exceptions. The channel had been narrow, but it had existed. Now it was closed. Meghan understood something else at once. A private request connected to her had been sitting inside that same route when Charles signed the order. Camilla had been considering whether to carry it further. William knew enough to worry. Charles knew enough to stop the process. And when that private request finally comes into focus, Camilla's humiliation begins to look like only one part of a much larger family collision. Camilla lost authority. Meghan lost hope. Charles risked losing peace inside his own family. Yet the deepest damage could not be measured by titles or palace procedure. It lived in the private expectations each person had carried into that morning. Camilla believed marriage had earned her trust. Meghan believed one remaining relationship inside the royal circle could still be useful. Charles believed both assumptions had become dangerous, and now each of them wanted something the others could not give. Camilla waited until the aides had left before asking the question that had been burning beneath her silence. Did Charles still trust her? The king did not answer quickly. He told her that he trusted her as his wife, but the household could no longer allow private loyalties to influence institutional decisions. Those decisions mattered because they shaped who could act in the monarch's name and who could gain access to sensitive royal occasions. The queen consort understood the message instantly. Losing the override was not simply an administrative correction. It felt like a personal demotion from the man whose confidence had given that authority meaning. Meghan felt the consequences from another direction. During a private conversation with Harry, she accused the palace of closing every route the moment it became useful to them. She had not been seeking an immediate return to royal duties. Her hope was narrower and more personal. Selected family occasions, recognition, limited access, and perhaps future appearances involving their children. Harry listened, then warned her that confronting Charles now could make the situation worse. Meghan pushed back. To her, silence had already cost too much, and losing Camilla as a possible bridge felt like proof that patience had achieved nothing. Camilla had seen the same possibility differently. In a documented private account, shared with a trusted household figure, she had argued that easing a few family restrictions might reduce years of bitterness and prevent another public rupture. She did not believe reconciliation required restoring old roles. She believed small openings could stop the family from hardening completely. Charles understood the instinct, but he feared the method. The king had begun to see compassion and authority pulling in opposite directions. William saw something more serious. The prince believed Camilla had crossed an invisible boundary by involving herself in decisions connected to people outside the working royal structure. For him, the issue was not whether Meghan deserved kindness. It was whether sensitive decisions could be reopened after the sovereign had considered them settled. The future king had already raised that concern privately, and his objections had begun before Meghan's latest request ever reached Camilla. That mattered because one earlier palace incident had changed William's concern into certainty. To understand why the king finally acted, the story has to return to the evening when one seemingly small intervention changed everything. The crisis did not begin with Charles's signature. It began several weeks earlier at Windsor, when a private family decision was quietly altered after the king believed it had already been settled. At first, the change seemed minor. No announcement followed. No confrontation erupted in public. But William noticed. Then Charles noticed. And when they discovered whose authority had been used to reopen the matter, a question entered the palace that could no longer be dismissed. Who was actually making the final decision? William learned the truth during a private briefing connected to preparations for a Windsor family service. The event had already been reviewed, and Charles had decided there would be no change to the guest arrangements. Yet a revised instruction had appeared, asking officials to reconsider whether Harry and Meghan might receive a private family invitation connected to the occasion. The request carried the king's household override, the delegated authority that allowed Camilla to alter certain internal instructions in the monarch's name. William closed the folder in front of him and looked directly at a senior aide. "Did my father authorize this?" The aide said nothing. That silence changed everything. The prince understood that this was not simply about Harry or Meghan attending one private gathering. Charles had already made a decision, and Camilla had reopened it without asking him first. For William, that meant the household no longer had one clear line of command. A settled instruction could be questioned, reconsidered, and quietly changed. The future king believed that kind of uncertainty could become far more dangerous once decisions involved ceremonial access, family status, or the next generation. Camilla defended herself when Charles confronted her privately. She told him she had not been trying to challenge his judgment. She had been trying to prevent another family wound. Meghan's message, shared through a documented private exchange, had not demanded a public royal return. It asked for something smaller, a private opening, one family occasion, one sign that years of bitterness had not completely destroyed every path back. That made the request easier for the Queen Consort to support. But Charles remained unmoved. He told her that good intentions could not justify using his authority after he had already spoken. William then brought forward something harder to dismiss. In records he had reviewed with senior household staff, the prince identified earlier moments when Camilla's privilege had complicated decisions officials believed were already settled. None had caused a public crisis. Together, however, they created a pattern. Charles could no longer treat Windsor as an isolated misunderstanding. The king still hesitated. Removing the privilege meant confronting his wife, not merely correcting procedure. William wanted something stronger. He wanted the ambiguity ended permanently. The next confrontation would not happen through aides, letters, or palace channels. Charles and Camilla would face each other with nowhere left to hide. Charles waited until they were alone. There were no private secretaries, no advisors, and no family members to soften what came next. He placed the Windsor record between them and asked Camilla why his authority had been used after his decision was already clear. She tried to explain the motive before defending the method. Charles stopped her. The argument was no longer about Meghan. It was about something more dangerous inside a monarchy. Whether the sovereign's final word was actually final. Camilla knew exactly what was at stake. The king's household override had originally existed because Charles wanted her to settle smaller private matters without forcing every household question back onto his desk. In simple terms, it allowed her to act with his delegated authority in limited internal decisions. Over time, however, that privilege had become more than convenience. It represented trust. It represented access. And now the queen consort could feel that trust being pulled away. She looked at her husband and said, "You gave me that trust." Charles answered without raising his voice, "I did. I did not give anyone permission to overturn me." The words landed harder than anger. Camilla insisted that she had never intended to challenge him. She argued that William had made the atmosphere worse by treating her like an outsider whenever succession, Catherine, Harry, or Meghan entered the discussion. The prince, she said, seemed to assume that every intervention from her carried a hidden motive. Charles refused to follow her there. He told her that William was not the subject of this conversation. The issue was what had been done in the monarch's name after the monarch had already decided otherwise. Charles then revealed how far his concern had gone. In a documented review of several disputed household decisions, he had found repeated moments when staff were unsure whether instructions reflected his direct wishes or decisions transmitted through Camilla's delegated authority. That confusion mattered because private household machinery depended on clarity. If aides could not tell where the final command came from, even a small family disagreement could become an institutional weakness. The king told her the system had become too vulnerable to continue. Camilla stopped defending herself. Before Charles said anything more, she understood where this was heading. He was not preparing to narrow the privilege. He was preparing to abolish it. Still, the king did not sign the final order immediately. One person had to hear the consequences first. Charles summoned William because removing Camilla's authority would reshape the balance inside the household, and the future king needed to understand what responsibility came with that change. By the time William enters the king's private office, the issue has moved beyond one marriage and into the machinery of succession itself. William got the outcome he had wanted, but there was no celebration. Charles made that clear the moment his son entered the room. The king agreed that competing lines of authority had become impossible. Yet he also warned William that removing Camilla's privilege could not become an excuse for humiliating her. The distinction mattered. Charles was defending the crown's chain of command, not inviting a family purge. And William suddenly understood that victory carried responsibility and a dangerous new expectation. William chose his words carefully. He told Charles that he had never wanted Camilla stripped of dignity. He wanted the ambiguity removed. The prince understood that the disputed privilege existed only because the monarch had personally delegated it, which meant only Charles could take it back. William had influence as heir, but not final command. That mattered because the decisions being made now would shape the institution he might one day inherit. The future king wanted a system where one instruction could not quietly compete with another. Charles listened, then admitted the cost. Taking authority away from his wife felt like protecting the crown in public while hurting someone he loved in private. The king had spent years defending Camilla's place beside him. Now he was drawing a boundary inside that same relationship. William heard the pain beneath the words and made one thing clear. He would not use the decision to weaken her publicly. Camilla, he said, could keep her dignity without keeping a power that had become too difficult to control. The king then set the new rule. Sensitive household decisions involving Harry, Meghan, future ceremonies, and succession-related appearances would now come directly through him or through a formally designated senior office, meaning an approved palace channel with clear written authority. No informal route would be allowed to carry the same weight. Charles wanted every decision traceable. William wanted every decision final. For once, father and son were aligned. That agreement had an immediate consequence. Camilla could no longer sponsor Meghan's pending request, not officially and not quietly. The queen consort might still offer an opinion, but she could no longer move that opinion through the household as though it carried the king's authority. One signature had turned her influence into advice. Then the news moved faster than expected. Meghan learned exactly what had happened before the order had fully circulated through the household. During a private conversation, Harry watched her expression change as the meaning became clear. This was not simply Camilla losing power. It was Meghan losing the only remaining route she believed might still open a door. Harry expected disappointment. He was not prepared for fury. The palace may have expected Camilla to be the angriest person in the story, but the first explosive reaction comes from somewhere else entirely. Meghan did not hear the news from Charles. She did not hear it from Camilla either. The message reached her through the collapse of a conversation that had been quietly developing for weeks. The answer was suddenly no, not delayed, not under discussion, not waiting for another meeting. No. Camilla no longer possessed the authority to carry the request further. Meghan immediately understood the timing, and what angered her most was the belief that the door had been closed precisely because she had reached it. Meghan's request had been carefully limited. She wanted Camilla to support a future private family invitation that could eventually create a route toward selected ceremonial appearances involving Harry and their children. A ceremonial appearance meant a formal royal occasion where family members could be publicly present without necessarily returning to full working duties. That distinction mattered because Meghan was not asking for an instant restoration of status. She wanted an opening. Losing Camilla made that almost impossible because Charles remained the final decision-maker, while William had become far less willing to entertain informal exceptions. The call ended, and Meghan turned to Harry with anger already rising. She asked why every possible opening seemed to disappear the moment their names became attached to it. Harry did not give her the answer she wanted. He refused to accuse Charles of making the decision solely to block them. The prince argued that Camilla's authority had become the larger issue, and that his father was trying to end confusion inside the household. Meghan heard caution. She felt abandonment. For her, the timing was too precise to ignore. Meghan's frustration quickly shifted toward William. In a recorded private conversation with Harry, she argued that the future king had pushed for the change because he feared Camilla could create a family pathway outside his influence. Harry warned her again not to turn suspicion into certainty. The disagreement cut deeper because both understood what was truly at stake. This was not one invitation. It was whether their family still had any personal bridge left inside the palace. Camilla's silence made everything worse. Meghan waited for reassurance, an explanation, anything that suggested the queen consort would continue fighting quietly. Nothing came. Camilla was still absorbing the humiliation of Charles removing her authority, and she had no appetite for another confrontation. The absence of a message told Meghan more than a message could have. Something shifted then. Anger gave way to a harder realization. If Camilla would no longer act for her, Meghan needed to hear that directly. And when Camilla finally speaks without advisors or intermediaries, She will give Meghan something far more painful than the answer she expected. Camilla had spent days feeling punished. Then something changed. Away from advisors, protocol, and arguments about who had been right, she faced the personal cost of continuing the fight. She could defend the privilege she had lost. She could resent William. She could even blame Charles for humiliating her. But she could no longer pretend that helping Meghan was worth deepening the fracture inside her own marriage. When the final private conversation came, Camilla made her choice, and Meghan heard it clearly. Camilla had finally accepted that Charles was not going to reverse himself. The privilege was gone, and private persuasion would not bring it back. More importantly, she now understood what the new boundary meant. Any future reconciliation involving Meghan would have to go directly through the king, not through alternate household channels or private influence. The queen consort still had access to her husband, but access was no longer the same as authority. That distinction hurt, because the power she had lost had once represented trust between them. The conversation with Meghan came without an aide managing it. Camilla spoke carefully and told her she would not challenge Charles again over the pending request. Meghan did not hide her disappointment. She said she had believed there was finally someone inside the family prepared to listen instead of judging every approach before it could begin. The words struck hard because Camilla knew there was truth inside that frustration. She had listened. She had believed one private opening might stop years of bitterness from hardening permanently. Camilla answered with painful clarity. In a recorded private conversation, she explained that listening and overriding the king had become two different things the moment Charles had already settled the matter. She could still understand Meghan's position. She could even sympathize with it. But she would no longer use her marriage as a route around her husband's decision. The queen consort had reached the point where protecting one relationship meant disappointing another. Meghan went quiet. The loss suddenly looked much larger than one family invitation. Camilla had been her final informal advocate inside Charles's closest circle, someone who could raise a difficult subject privately before it reached official channels. Without her, there was no softer path left. Meghan would now have to face the king's decision directly, and eventually William's resistance as well. That realization ended the private struggle, but it created something far more dangerous outside the family. Once word spread that Camilla had stepped back and Meghan's route had collapsed, the story escaped palace control. What had been whispered through private rooms is about to become a public symbol, and the outside world will choose its own winners and losers. By morning, the story no longer belonged to Charles, Camilla, or Meghan. It belonged to everyone watching them. Commentators argued over whether the king had strengthened his authority or humiliated his wife. Others focused on Meghan, asking why a decision concerning Camilla had triggered such anger thousands of miles away. But one particular front page crystallized the entire crisis in a single brutal image. Charles standing alone beneath the words, "The king's word is final," while Camilla's lost authority dominated the national conversation. Camilla saw the headline at breakfast and folded the paper before finishing the article. Palace officials were already describing the change as a clarification of private household authority, meaning the internal power to issue sensitive instructions in the monarch's name. They stressed that her ceremonial rank and marriage to Charles had not changed. But the queen consort knew the technical explanation could not erase the emotional reality. To the public, she had lost something important, and everyone now had permission to debate what that loss said about her husband's trust. Charles watched her reaction and understood the cost immediately. Camilla told him she would not answer the headlines, even though she felt personally exposed. The king agreed. A public defense, he feared, would only turn an internal decision into an open family war. Their silence was meant to calm the story. Instead, it created space for others to define it. Meghan became increasingly frustrated as coverage connected her anger to the disappearance of Camilla's informal support. She felt commentators were presenting her reaction as entitlement, when, in a recorded private conversation with Harry, she described it as grief over another failed attempt to rebuild limited family contact. Harry urged restraint again. Meghan listened, but the Duchess could not ignore how quickly the story had transformed her private disappointment into a public accusation about motive. Then Buckingham Palace became the center of the spectacle. A crowd gathered outside as broadcasters delivered live updates, and one correspondent repeatedly described Charles's decision as a reset of who can speak with the king's authority. That phrase spread because it captured the deeper issue. This was no longer only about Camilla or Meghan. It was about whether royal power could be shared informally at all. William refused to celebrate. The prince declined every opportunity to present the decision as a personal victory, and that restraint unexpectedly lowered the temperature. He had wanted structural clarity, not Camilla's humiliation. Charles noticed. So did she. But the king knew silence could not be the final answer. With the noise outside growing louder, Charles made one last private decision about Camilla, Meghan, and William, one that would determine who had truly lost, who had gained, and what the crown would carry forward. The cameras can argue about winners, but the real verdict will come when Charles decides what remains after the privilege, the anger, and the family struggle are stripped away. Charles had removed Camilla's authority, but he had not removed her place beside him. That distinction became the final meaning of the entire crisis. The king refused to restore the privilege. He refused to punish William for challenging it, and he refused to reopen Meghan's request, simply because anger had followed his decision. For perhaps the first time in this conflict, every person received an answer that could not be negotiated. It hurt, but it was clear, and clarity finally ended the struggle. Charles confirmed the decision privately and without hesitation. The king's household override was permanently abolished, meaning Camilla could no longer independently transmit sensitive instructions under the monarch's personal authority. The change mattered because it removed the ambiguity that had caused the crisis in the first place. Yet the king made another point equally clear. His wife was not being pushed out. Her public standing remained intact. Her place beside him remained intact. What had changed was the boundary between personal influence and sovereign authority. Camilla heard that distinction directly from Charles. He told her that removing the privilege had been one of the hardest decisions he had made, because protecting their marriage could not mean weakening the clarity of his role. The queen consort did not argue this time. She understood that continuing the fight would turn one painful decision into a permanent wound between them. So she stopped defending the authority she had lost and chose something quieter instead. Her marriage, her public duty, and the dignity of remaining beside him without demanding the power she once carried. Meghan reached a colder conclusion. The fury faded because there was nothing left to fight through informal channels. She understood that any future relationship with the royal family would require direct consent from Charles, and eventually, cooperation from William. There would be no hidden advocate, no private route, no soft intervention through Camilla. Meghan had lost the pathway she wanted, but she had gained something impossible to misunderstand: certainty. William responded with restraint. The prince made no attempt to diminish Camilla after the decision, and Charles noticed. That mattered because the future king had succeeded in removing the ambiguity without turning victory into humiliation. The heir had pushed for structural control, but he refused to use the outcome as a personal weapon. In doing so, he helped stabilize the family at the exact moment it could have fractured further. Charles had drawn the final boundary. Affection could shape royal relationships, but affection could not replace clear authority. Camilla lost power, but kept her marriage. Meghan lost her hidden pathway, but gained certainty. William inherited a cleaner chain of command without publicly humiliating the Queen. And the king proved that even the person closest to the monarch could not permanently share the monarch's final word. And that was the real consequence of the king's decision. Camilla remained beside Charles, Meghan remained outside the closed door. William inherited a clearer path forward, and the crown emerged with only one voice capable of saying yes. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.